Hello, my name is Arnold Horner, and I'm going to talk this evening about some maps of County Offaly, then known as Kings County, that were made some 200 years ago. These maps are some of them well known, but others have come to light only recently. And I'm going to particularly talk about three tracings that show parts of West Offaly. Before doing that, I just want to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. First of all, the images that I show are the copyright of various institutions, among them the National Library of Ireland, the National Archives of Ireland, the British Library, and Offaly Archives. I also want to mention that I'm going to talk mainly in terms of Kings County, which was the title then applied to Offaly. I won't be using the term Offaly as much as perhaps some of you would like. Now, to introduce the topic, this is all about map making, and it's specifically about the maps of County Offaly, Kings County, in the early 19th century. During this talk, you will meet various individuals, and it's worth naming them now. William Larkin, an engineer, a road surveyor, and a county mapmaker, is probably the star of the show. Also important are the Boggs commissioners, who between 1809 and 1813 were appointed to report on the extent and potential of the bogs of Ireland, and the bogs of Kings County were central to their report. Also important is one of the Boggs engineers, John Longfield, who surveyed extensive parts of Kings County before he moved on to an area in North Roscommon. Each of these players had a role in mapping Kings County Offaly in the early 19th century. This talk is then in two parts. The first is where we set the scene on the mapping of counties in the early 1800s and where we meet the various actors. Having done that, we will look at some of those recently conserved tracings that help show or throw new light on how William Larkin mapped Kings County Offaly in the early 1800s. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about making maps of Irish counties. This is a tradition that goes back to the late 16th century, when some maps of counties, including a map of Eastern Offaly and of Eastern County Laois as it is now, were made as early as 1650. Almost 100 years later, in 1685, William Petty made an atlas of maps for each county in Ireland, which was published in the volume Hiberniae Delineatio in 1685. Then, nearly 80 years later, came a further flurry of county maps, most of which were made by various private surveyors and mapmakers, and which covered some counties much more than others. Many of these later county maps were commissioned by local county grand juries. The grand juries were the local authorities of the period. From the 1830s on, then, the Ordnance Survey of Ireland, which still exists and operates and flourishes today, was to the fore. So this is a map of Kings County in the late 17th century, as it was published in Hiberniae Delineatio in 1685. It's derived from the famous Down survey that was undertaken by Sir William Petty, where he made maps on a barony and parish basis covering large parts of Ireland in the mid-1650s. And one of the striking features of this map is how uneven the coverage is. Protestant-owned areas are usually with very little detail. The main bogs are given a light grey shade, and some parts of the county, which were still in Catholic ownership in the 1650s, receive a great deal of attention. Here's what it looks like when we go a little bit closer up. This is an area near Geeshill in County Offaly, in the middle of County Offaly, and we're looking at areas where there's blanks and areas where there's bogs, and then areas where there's quite a lot of place name detail. Here's the western part of Kings County, and striking is the extent of the bogland, and it's also striking, I think, just how much detail there is in parts of this area. We have various places that we can pick out. The 7 churches of Clonmacnoise up there in the top left-hand corner. The River Shannon. Verban is marked. Loch Bura appears. Banagher appears. Ballyboy is marked. And Burr and Kinnity appear near the south of the map. This is a further enlargement looking at the Brosnah Banagher area as it was in the 1650s and as it was published in the 1680s. You can see the town of Banagher is marked with a church spire. Garry Castle is mentioned. Lusma Bog is mentioned. There is a bridge shown across the River Brosnah. So we're getting quite a lot of detail being recorded, although there's also quite a lot of detail, it has to be said, that doesn't appear on some of these maps. Bridges appear on the Silver River, which is an area moving west from, a river moving west from the Slieve Bloom Mountains. And you can see at Kilcormac, which I've got marked here, there is a church and a mill. There's a church at Ballyboy, and it appears as if they're recording quite a bit of a settlement. And they record, I think it looks like 3 bridges across various sections of the Silver River. So again, here in this part of County Offaly, quite a lot of detail is shown. But this is an uneven county coverage. And it was only in the 18th century, 80 years later, that more comprehensive, more up-to-date maps were made for some counties across Ireland. These, as I've said already, were usually for the grand juries, and they particularly found an application in roads repairs and planning, and in applications for funding from the grand juries for various roads projects. Sometimes just a couple of these maps were made, and only a few of them were printed and circulated more widely. As I've said already, the county maps made from 1750 onwards were compiled by private surveyors, operating on their own or in partnership, and working with very small teams of assistants, perhaps 4 or 5 men in total. They gave particular attention to roads and perhaps also to the houses of potential customers. Probably some of these county surveys were completed in 1 or 2 seasons. The measuring instruments were probably a chain or wheel, which was brought along roads, together with an early form of the theodolites that is an instrument that takes angles and which means that you can calculate lengths by taking angles and using the principles of trigonometry. A few surveys involved more elaborate triangulation surveys. This is a picture of a surveyor at work in the 1720s in County Kerry, and it gives us perhaps some sense of the kind of man who was going around the countryside at that particular time making the surveys. This is a map which was of County Kildare, which is part of a map of County Kildare, which was one of the first of the new mid-18th century county maps, made by John Noble and James Keenan, two local men, in 1752. It has the distinction of showing some nearby parts of Kings County, including the town of Edenderry as it was at that particular time. Another map of County Kildare was made by Alexander Taylor in 1783, just 30 years later. And like the 1752 map, it was engraved and published. And as in 1752, this map shows small sections of Kings County, including again Edenderry and the intended course for the canal, the great late 18th century project that started out in Dublin in 1756 and had finally reached the Shannon in 1804. Unlike Kildare, no map of Kings County, Offaly, that is based on original survey work survives from the 18th century. A map may have been completed in the 1740s or 1750s by the ingenious John Mooney. He's called ingenious in his death entry in the Geeshill Parish Records. He was a land surveyor based at Geeshill in the middle of County Offaly, but all that seems to have survived are some vague references to tracings from this map of Kings County, references that are part of the Hillsborough Estate Records in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. Now, a further phase of county map making can be identified from the late 18th century, especially from the mid-1790s, when the government started giving quite attractive grants to make it possible for grand juries to commission the making of county maps. New map makers appeared at that time too. William McRae in the north, Neville Bath in the south, and our man William Larkin across the Midland counties. In some cases, just one or two hand-drawn maps were made. But where enough funds were available, many of the county maps went on to be engraved and printed in multiple copies, and funds for printing the county map were provided by grand jury charges or by seeking support from subscribers. Alongside the county maps, barony maps were sometimes made. These were usually kept in manuscript, but they were a kind of supplement, a kind of local supplement to the county map. So in the case of Kings County, there were 11 or 12 baronies at that time, and each of these might have had a barony map being made at the same time as the county map. The barony map would have been kept in the grand jury rooms in Phillipstown, now Dangan, and later perhaps in the grand jury room in Tullamore. Now, let's focus on William Larkin again, the roads surveyor and maker of Irish county maps, who was responsible for the map of Kings County between 1806 and 1808. We know a limited amount about Larkin. He was born around 1770. He attended the Dublin Society Drawing School, which was where a lot of young surveyors and engineers and others learned technical and other aspects of drawing at that time. And around 1800 to 1802, he undertook some farm or estate surveys in Donegal. From 1804 onwards, he was getting a large number of commissions for various types of maps. He made a general map showing the new mail coach roads. He did surveys of the routes the new roads should follow, perhaps mapping 2,000 miles across Ireland. And he made a series of new county maps. This is an early work by Larkin, a map of the actual and proposed mail coach roads in 1805, which has the interesting detail of telling you the time at which the mail coach arrived and departed from various towns and villages, various post towns across Ireland. And this is a road survey that he undertook. This is the title panel for his survey for the Kings County section of the Clane to Tullamore Road in 1811, and this map is preserved in the National Library of Ireland. This is what Tullamore looks like on that particular map, and as you can see, if your eyes become accustomed to it, the buildings are in pink, and we get quite a detailed layout of the town, and we see the town resplendent with its new canal harbour as well. And then in black, I think it is, we might be able to pick out the Catholic Church in the town too. Larkin began, as I've said, picking up commissions from grand juries to make new county maps sometime around 1804 to 5. And it looks as if he went around counties soliciting the business, and because he started quite a few counties at that particular time. He made these maps at the same time as he was doing road surveys. So in a way he was economizing on his work by doing the two things at the same time. Some of these county maps were later published. Westmeath appeared early in 1808, Meade after a very long time in 1817, and four others in 1819, just before Larkin is thought to have died. No details of his death are known. Other county maps, however, remained unpublished, and he made 6 or 7 of these, including Kings County. Larkin's map of Westmeath was probably his best county map. Engraved in London, published in 4 sheets in 1808, and then 2 years later as a smaller scale single sheet in 1810. This is what the 4-sheet version of Larkin's map of Westmeath looks like when it's pasted together. And you can see the top northeastern corner looks a little bit different to the rest, probably because it was done by a different engraver. Here's a little bit of Larkin's map of Westmeath where it borders on Kings County. There in the right centre near the top is the town of Moat, or Moat a Greenogue as it was then known. And we get little bits of information like the layout of the town of Clara, and you can see Ballycumber appearing at the bottom of the map. Now, Larkin's Kings County map was being compiled at the same time as the Westmeath map, but it never got published. it did not get enough subscribers. So the map remained as a hand-drawn version, perhaps held by the grand jury. You see, they needed something like 200 subscribers, each offering perhaps 2 guineas a head for the map, or perhaps a little bit more, to make the printing and engraving and printing of the map viable. And it looks like the population of Offaly just were not willing to stump up to that degree. So we had a hand-drawn map of the county instead. And that was probably kept in the grand jury rooms, but at some stage it disappeared. So what did it look like? Well, in an odd, curious twist of fate, we do know a little bit about what it looked like, because the Boggs commissioners came in and ordered a version of that county map in 1809. They were established then to report on the principal bogs of Ireland, and within a week of their establishment, they decided that they would buy in existing intelligence, including a version of Larkin's King's County map. This would help them accelerate their appraisal and their understanding of the extent of bogs in Ireland. So they paid Larkin £300, which was a pretty high sum at that stage, to provide them with a large manuscript, hand-drawn map that showed the bogs across the entire county. This map was a simplified version of his unpublished county map, and it was supplied to the Boggs Commissioners 3 months later and is now preserved in the National Archives of Ireland. It's a huge map, 8 feet high by 12 feet wide. And this is what it looks like. And it gives a very good impression of the bogs of Ireland, of County Offaly at that particular time. This is the area south of Tullamore, including Charleville Domain, and the bogland areas are clearly picked out. This is an area north and east of Parsonstown, or Birr as it was then called. The town is there in the bottom left-hand corner of this particular extract, and this sort of map. Here it is in more detail. Parsonstown, where this sort of map gives us quite a lot of information, gives us quite a lot of detail, particularly about the bogs and about the layout of towns like Birr. But it doesn't give as much detail as you might have expected on the original county map. Why did Larkin need to put in all the detail on the county map when it was the bogs that the Boggs Commissioners were understandably interested in? During 1809 to 11, large parts of Offaly were mapped by various engineers involved with the Boggs Commissioners' survey programme. In the west of the county, the mapping was undertaken by John Longfield. He was one of the leading land surveyors of the early 19th century. Working in partnership and on his own from an office at 67 Grafton Street, Dublin, he reported to the Boggs Commissioners, as I've said already, on 2 districts: the Brosnah district covering much of West Offaly and the area around Lough Gara in North Roscommon. This map here shows the extent of the area in grey, the area mapped by Longfield. It's an area that extends from Tullamore to Birr, from the Slieve Bloom Mountains in the east to Banagher in the west. It's a large part of the western Offaly. And he produced several sets of maps that show in quite beautiful detail the extent of the bogs in that part of Offaly. And these maps are preserved in the National Library of Ireland. This is a huge map. It's 6 feet wide by nearly 5 feet high. It's a bit deteriorated now, but you can see in brown the extent of those bogs, and in the nearest to us, the Slieve Bloom Mountains, as represented by John Longfield as part of his Boggs Commission survey. Another of his maps is better preserved, and this is the Tullamore area as it appears on Longfield's map made in 1810. And this is an area near Cadamstown in the foothills of the Slieve Bloom Mountains, where you can see a small chapel at Cloneen, or Cluneen maybe it's called, near Lettybrook is marked. And again, we're grateful to Longfield for mapping the detail of the roads and the detail of the bogs in this particular area. He submitted a very detailed, long, 92-page handwritten report on the bogs of the Brosnah district, and that was accompanied by 11 district maps that showed particular bogs. This one shows the area around Banagher, and when you look at it in a little bit of detail, you can see you get a lot of detail about the street layout. The buildings are generalised and shown in black here in the Banagher area. And there seems to be what may be a Catholic chapel, but it's not in the same position as Larkin shows it in another of his maps. Here's another of Longfield's maps, this time showing an area between Tullamore and Birr at Five Alley, and at a little bit further to the south at Rath. And you can see he marks in the chapels in both villages, as well as giving quite a lot of detail, as you can see, about the drainage of the Thomastown bog immediately to the east. This is what the Tullamore area looks like when we look at it on Longfield's map of 1810 to 11, and you can see also that what he does a very nice image of the Charleville domain and of the Boggs, Ballard and Killeen Moor immediately to the south of Tullamore. And some comparison might be made between how he shows the street layout in Tullamore and how Larkin shows it. So the summary so far is the maps of Larkin and Longfield, just described, provide valuable perspectives on both settlement and landscape in Kings County in the early 19th century. They are especially significant records of the extent of bogland, coming as they do 150 years after Petty and nearly 200 years before the present time. Now we move to the second part of this talk, which is about a group of map tracings recently donated to Offaly Archives, which adds value to the existing information. It's particularly interesting in relation to what is known about William Larkin's mapping of Kings County during the period 1806 to 1808. These are map tracings that were donated by Mr. George Gossip of County Galway, which were subsequently conserved for Offaly Archives by Liz Darcy of Paperworks Studios, County Wicklow, and they're tracings that are on some sort of fairly strong, durable, transparent oil paper. This is what they look like when you look at them at a distance, and I've set them out there just sort of in their approximate relative positions. There's a fourth tracing that appears to show parts of the River Suir near Waterford, and this may have been from part of Larkin's preparation for his map of County Waterford in 1819. This tracing is not considered further here, but it does raise the prospect that there may be other tracings out there besides the Offaly ones that are our focus this evening. Here's how the tracings relate to the 1685 map of Western Offaly. So we have in red an area around Banagher, in blue an area extending from Burr in the south towards Loch Burla and going in the general direction of Tullamore, and then in green an area between around Cloughan and Furban. And this is how they look like on a later map that perhaps allows you to get the orientation of the various maps a little bit clearer, and which no doubt will require quite a lot of study to see exactly what was covered by the tracings. So let's look at these tracings in turn now. Tracing number 1 extends northeast from Parsonstown or Burr, and this is a tracing that takes in much of the parish of Eglish. It's centred on the road marked here in red from Burr towards Tullamore, and the area covered extends to Whigsborough and Five Alley and goes a little bit further to the northeast. Burr marks the southern limit. And when we look at this in a little bit more detail, we can see just how much is actually revealed by these maps. There are various form lines that indicate to Larkin where the hills were and how the slopes were represented. But here we have the area around Burr or Parsonstown, and we have quite a lot of detail which is particularly useful, as we will see later, when comparisons are made with the Ordnance Survey in the 1830s. Burr was at that time the largest town in the county. It had a population of over 5,400 in 1821. And this is a bit further to the northeast. Eglish, and Eglish, the old parish church where the Protestant church was based, and a landlord's castle was, and a bleach mill, and then to the northeast again, Five Alley, close to which there was at that time a Catholic chapel, and its location deserves some notice because it's further to the northeast of Five Alley, whereas today the modern chapel is to the southwest of Five Alley. And then we have the area around Whigsborough, which is a large estate house near Five Alley, and then you can just about make out probably Loch Cowra up there in the northwest of in the top left of our imagery here. Loch Cowra, which is no longer a lake at all, it's been drained, but which was quite a substantial feature in the early 19th century. Now, tracing number 2 comes into, we have to try to, I've got to get this working. Tracing number 2 runs from Banagher in the north and extends south as far as Burr, nearly as far as Burr in any case. And what it includes is much of the parish of Lushma and Rhina a little bit further to the east. Tracing number 2 includes detail on the area around Banagher, And Banagher at that time was a substantial town on the Shannon, a trading port in effect, with a population of nearly 3,000. And this shows some of the detail of the layout of the town and where various features are located. The chapel was then within the town area. The church was within the town area. There seems to be a feature identified as the Royal Hospital. There's what seems to be possibly a feature that says jail. And then much further out we have the ruins of Garry Castle, the old medieval castle at Garry Castle. And then various other features are marked as well, including the animal pound. Here's part of Lushma parish, the area north of Newtown and northeast of Cloughan Castle is shown here, and we'll see it in a little bit more detail in the next slide, which shows I think again various features. There's Callonalock Common beside the River Brosnah. It's identified here. There's a church in ruins. There's a chapel, which is later described in the Ordnance Survey as in ruins. And there's Cloughan Castle, which is shown here too. And I think there might be an image of a possible windmill up there in the top right at Cloughan Beg. Now, tracing number 3, and again we're hopping a little bit here. Tracing number 3 takes in Forban and Cloughan, the village of Cloughan, and it extends as far northeast as Pullock, and goes as far south as the former Loch Bura. This is an area that takes in large parts of the civil parishes of Gallen and Wheary or Kilagally. And this is what the detail for the area around Forban looks like. This is Forban about 1806, and you can see we get quite a lot of information about where the buildings were. We can see the bridge over the Brosnah. We can see where the chapel was. We can see where the church is, and we get some names, local place names as well. It's showing the place in quite a lot of detail here, and this is a village that at that time had a population of nearly 600 people. Cloughan was growing but was smaller, and here the building detail is shown just like in Forban, but there's less words, less naming to various features, so it's a little bit harder to work out just what exactly is being shown in the Cloughan area. So that's what the tracings look like. Now let's try and put them in some sort of context. And to do that, we're going to compare the tracings with some of those other maps that we've already introduced, particularly the work of John Longfield and what is already known about the work of William Larkin. So we're going to compare Longfield's Boggs maps and Larkin's Boggs map with the tracings that we've just been looking at. And we're going to see how do representations of particular places vary between the work of these 3 different survey efforts. Here's Cloughan, as shown by Longfield on the left, on the Larkin Boggs map in the centre, and on the tracing in the right. And it's quite hard to make it out because there's quite a lot of area shown here. there's a place called Strawberry Hill you will see up on the top left on Longfield's map, and then you can see that Larkin shows it in a different way, but really it's quite hard to work out just how much is different on these maps perhaps. Now, here's Cloughan in more detail, as is shown on the tracing on the left and on Larkin's Boggs map on the right. And some things are left out. I don't think that the chapel appears on the Boggs map, but it does appear, I think, on between the O and the G on the tracing. But what you see here, I think, is that the general layout of the roads is identical in both on both maps, and that the buildings have been generalized for the Boggs map, whereas they appear as individual buildings quite often on the tracing. Now let's go to Forban, and we'll try and show how the different representations appear for Forban. Up there on the left is Longfield's version of Forban, and then in the centre is the tracing, and on the right is the Boggs map. Let's go and have a look at the features on the tracing on the left and on the Boggs map on the right. And can you try to match features on the two images? Can you see the church near the top? And the church is there on both maps. The chapel is shown perhaps more precisely on the tracing, and then it's rather generalized on the Boggs map. Is at the east end of the town, and you can probably start picking out some of the buildings and see that the building, on the Boggs version, the building lines are much more generalized, but there's quite a lot of similarities out there as well. Now, this is Loch Burra, and I think Loch Burra is quite interesting. This is how Loch Burra was shown on two maps by Longfield, and then how Loch Burra appears on the two maps by Larkin. And what's striking about Larkin's Loch Burra is that there's this peninsula that intrudes from the south into the middle of the lake, and that's shown on both of them. There's a very striking similarity between the Boggs map version of Loch Burra, which is the top middle one here, and the tracing map version of Loch Burra, which is on the right hand side. Another comparison can also be made between Larkin's mapping of the 1800s and the Ordnance Survey mapping 30 years later. So here's an attempt to see Loch Burra as shown by Larkin, and then as it was shown by the Ordnance Survey. And the lake shape varies, which is quite understandable because it depended on the season what the shape of the lake was really and how much water there was in it. But the boundary lines are very striking on both the Larkin map and on the Ordnance Survey map, and they're very similar. And this is an impression of Loch Cowra, which, as I said before, lies northwest of Five Alley and is a lake that no longer exists. And it looks as if the Ordnance Survey shows a larger area occupied by Loch Cowra than Larkin does. These are small lakes that were once an important feature of the wetlands of County Offaly, and which were subsequently drained, but which may be of significance and interest as we reevaluate our wetlands policy in the future. I'm going to finish with one other comparison between the maps of Larkin and of the Ordnance Survey, and this is how the maps highlight a period of chapel and church renewal in West Offaly during the early 19th century. Chapel applies to Catholic churches, church applies to the established or Protestant church of that particular period. And the Ordnance Survey mapping that was undertaken in the 1830s was much better resourced and measured than Larkin's work. And this is the kind of detail that you can find on the 6 inches to 1 mile Ordnance Survey maps of that particular period. And it shows a church there at near the centre, just west of the centre of Cloughan, that had been built in 1813 after Larkin, but now a feature of Cloughan, and a new chapel that had also been erected sometime between Larkin's period and the Ordnance Survey period. In Birr, the Catholic chapel, the centre of the Diocese of Killaloe, remains at the centre, at the same site on both Larkin's and on the Ordnance Survey maps. So Larkin's map is on the tracing is on the left-hand side here, and the Ordnance Survey black and white version is on the right-hand side. And you can see the church has moved. The church has been moved to a more prominent position and rebuilt, but the chapel, the cathedral, remains at the same position in both cases. At least I think it remains in the same position in both cases. Hope I'm right in that regard. In the case of Five Alley, we have on the Ordnance Survey map of the 1830s, which is shown here, the chapel has moved. Where it was on Larkin's map was to the northeast of the village. It's now marked as site of R.C. Chapel, and the new chapel is to the southwest of the village and is marked as R.C. Chapel. In the case of Lushma at Clochan a new large R.C. chapel has been built at the crossroads, and the old chapel shown by Larkin is described as R.C. Chapel in ruins, and according to Samuel Lewis in his volume on the Topographical Dictionary of Ireland in 1837, it was in use for a school. This is Banagher in 1838, and the Old Town Church has been resited to a new church erected in 1829 just outside the town, and the chapel appears to have also been resited. But we get a record here in Larkin's tracings of just where those particular buildings were, and we know that quite a big reciting exercise seems to have taken place for both church and chapel between 1808 and 1838. This is for Ban, and for Ban the church had been built or rebuilt in 1804, so it appears on Larkin's map, but the chapel has been relocated from east of the village to west of the village between 1808 and 1838. Two further issues or questions briefly occupy the remaining period. How did Larkin undertake his map surveys, and for what purpose were these tracings made? Well, judging by these tracings, it doesn't look as if Larkin undertook a comprehensive formal survey that perhaps involved a formally measured triangulation. There's no evidence of triangulation on these tracings. They seem to me to be much more like carefully drawn sketches, where perhaps measurements and compass bearings were taken along the roads, and where prominent detail, mostly that visible from roads, was sketched in. Carefully drawn sketches producing quite a lot of information, but an uneven treatment, with some places receiving rather more attention than others. That's almost inevitable when you have a sketch mapping approach. And finally, for what purpose were these tracings made? The tracings cover significant parts of West Offaly, but they are not jigsaw-like puzzle pieces that fit neatly together. Other tracings, which are now missing, must have been made to cover other areas, and this makes it harder to work out the purpose of the tracings. Perhaps all that can be said at present is that they look more like preliminaries for some larger map, and less likely to be tracings from some already existing map. Almost certainly they were inputs to the county map that Larkin never succeeded in getting published. And in this sense, the tracings are quite unique, as the final county map now exists only in its edited Boggs Commissioner's version. And they're also significant because similar inputs to other county maps made across Ireland are either rare or non-existent. Fortunately, these exceptional documents have been preserved through the interest and initiative of various individuals, Mr. George Gossip, Liz Darcy, the Offaly Archives, and the Heritage Council, who has supported their conservation. To all of them, we are grateful. Thank you.